Connecting for Conservation to CTIC is really bringing folks together from across the whole ag spectrum, all the stakeholders from farmers and ranchers to government to the food and beverage companies. And really broadly, the folks that are generally represented in CTIC's membership, which include all of those groups.
Connecting for conservation. At some level, it's the most fundamental part of getting conservation on the ground. But at another, it may still be more of a mystery and art form than the conservation systems we're trying to encourage farmers to adopt. At Purdue University, social scientist Linda Prokopi explains why.
So social sciences are broadly the understanding why humans do what they do, right? There's a number of different social sciences. Some, like psychology, look very much at the individual characteristics, very cognitive. Others, like sociology, are looking more broadly at community dynamics. Many social scientists working in the agricultural space, like myself, are quite interdisciplinary in terms of the social science that we apply. And we'll look at those cognitive characteristics of an individual, but we'll also look at community dynamics and understand the importance of both of those types of factors. Plus, of course, economics is another social science because cost and economies do come into play.
Through the lens of those social sciences, we can take the first step of learning who to connect and to what. And we can start to understand why farmers don't choose certain farming practices.
It costs money to adopt practices, and we know that is a barrier. But even beyond that, if cost was the only barrier, we'd still see quite a lot more adoption with available cost share, support from NGOs and other entities. Other barriers beyond cost are control. So, for example, a lot of farming is done on rented farmland where the actual person farming the land does not control what happens on the land. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge barrier. It's barriers call them barriers in networks. So the farmer has many trusted advisors, and if the trusted advisors are telling that individual, the farmer, different things, we often see less adoption because there's just a lot of noise, right? And as humans, we don't like noise, right? And if we're getting different answers, different stories, the easiest path is to maintain the status quo.
At the Conservation Technology Information Center, Mike Comp points out that the conservation community is probably more cohesive than ever, even as messages and languages are evolving.
I think if you just look over the last couple of years, I've noticed just a much more willingness for people to work together, to think outside the box and figure out what are new ways to push conservation. And whether they phrase it as conservation or sustainability or climate smart ag is the new word now. The encouraging thing is that folks are at the table and they're wanting to engage in a meaningful way.
It's not just the vocabulary that's evolving. So is the awareness that different conservation messages work for different individuals.
What we've come to understand is that there's a lot that determines whether or not a farmer adopts a practice beyond the biophysical science and beyond the simple economics of cost benefits of a practice. Farmers are motivated, like all humans, by their own personal identities. So, for example, a farmer who has more of a stewardship identity is more prone to view information about conservation practices in a positive light than another farmer might. There are all kinds of family dynamics, all types of other demographic, interpersonal characteristics that influence whether or not a farmer adopts a practice. And trying to understand those and tease those out helps us do a better job on the ground.
Farmers of different ages may also be moved by different messages.
What we tend to find with age of the farmer is that the younger a farmer is, the more likely they are to adopt a conservation practice. But of course, that's a generalization. When we actually tease that apart by the type of practice, we start to see some signals that older farmers are more likely to adopt structural practices. So practices that perhaps take land out of production, practices that are really protecting land for the future. So practices like wetlands or structural buffers. And I think that signals the importance that older generation is putting on stewarding the land for the future. Whereas obviously when you're a new starting out farmer, a younger farmer, it's hard to take that long view. But we do see those younger farmers adopting more infield practices like cover crops and no-till.
At the Sand County Foundation, Heidi Peterson is careful to assess what sorts of information are going to be useful to the person she's working with.
If people go into a conversation with a private landowner telling them what to do, That's not the best way to make a change on the landscape. The best approach is to go into a conversation, hear what the goals are of that landowner, and then work together with them to meet those goals.
Finding that common goal, then getting to it, requires relationships with the right messengers.
In order to make sure that the process moves forward and you can advance that conversation and leading it into implementation, is knowing going into the process that it's not going to happen overnight. So you build up that relationship. Trust is so important and critical for making a change on the landscape.
Kim Stackhouse Lawson, Director of AgNext and Professor of Animal Science at Colorado State University, saw the power of relationships and trust when she headed up sustainability initiatives for a global meat company.
The cultural dynamics will determine which practices they choose to employ and whether or not they're informed by science or not. It's really fascinating. So I would say that very rarely did we see practices repeated across the globe. What we saw were networks repeated across the globe, and where we had the most successful sustainability programs, we had the strongest social relationships. That social network was the strongest, and there was trust in the system. Where we had trust, we had success.
At Purdue, Prokopi says crop consultants and other close contacts may be the best messengers of all for conservation.
So some of the most effective messengers for conservation it's going to be, again, those people in the farmer's trusted network. So certified crop advisors, other consultants who come out to the farm, who the farmer often sees a lot more often than they see their local extension educator, their local county offices for NRCS or SWCD. So we tend to find those folks very influential. But it's also important that those people, the certified crop advisors, et cetera, retailers, are talking to the conservation staff so they understand more about conservation and what the positives and the negatives, and they can present those fairly.
The next big step is bringing people together from the USDA Service Center, the Conservation District, and the community. The important part, says Heidi Peterson, is making sure all the key players are there.
Everybody who's been engaged from the start of the project needs to have a seat at the table. And I say that because you also need to think about at the beginning of a project who's present and who's, has a voice. Because oftentimes you get all the way through a project and then you realize the most important stakeholder wasn't present. And I see it happen very, very often where the partner or that stakeholder who is the one that we're relying on to make the change, they're not present. And that often is the case with, if we're working on a watershed plan or an implementation plan. Well, if it's the individuals who are living within an urban area making the decisions for the rural area, then how do we know that the practices make sense?
Once you've got the people, you need to make sure they all understand the message.
I am always going to say that there needs to be the data present. There needs to be the reason why everyone is coming together needs to be explained properly at the beginning of a meeting or a conversation or project discussion. If people are coming together and are at a meeting and there's no time spent on framing up the issue at hand, then everyone's going to leave wondering, what did I just spend my last hour discussing? And so it needs to be clear upfront, what is the goal we're trying to achieve?
One of the projects Prokopi has studied was the Indian Creek Watershed project in northeastern Illinois. Every single farmer in the watershed was contacted to discuss conservation practices. By the end of the project, more than 60% of the farmers and about 57% of the watershed's farm acreage was enrolled in conservation practices and BMPs to protect local water quality. Indian Creek stands as a shining example of connecting for conservation at a community-wide level.
So Indian Creek is a pretty unique watershed. It's a very small watershed. It's pretty homogenous in terms of the community. But some of the things that they did really well in terms of getting adoption on the ground was having a lot of meetings, getting people to those meetings, having trusted advisors working together. So a lot of collaboration amongst trusted advisors in the Indian Creek watershed. The role of CTIC in helping to facilitate those relationships was also really important, bringing people together and really starting to shift norms so that the norms in the watershed were very pro-conservation, and that makes a big difference.
One of the cornerstones of success in Indian Creek was Terry Bachtold, a lifelong resident of the area, farmer, and employee of the local Soil and Water Conservation District. Here's what Terry told us back in 2015 as CTIC's stage of the project was wrapping up, about what helped ensure the success of the effort.
We sat down and came up with a list of producers that we worked with, that we knew real well. Like I say, I live in the area, so I knew most of them anyway. And so we went out and asked them, okay, would you be willing to serve on the steering committee? And actually everyone we asked said yes. So it was people that was well respected, and people that was, they could get along together. We felt like that there was not going to be an issue of, I want to do this and that. So it was sort of a cohesive group of people we pulled together. So when we went out and sort of selected our steering committee, we went all the way from we had some small local produce people on the steering committee. We had 3 of the commercial type ag producers in that predominantly corn, soybeans. We had a couple of livestock individuals, that one's a dairy. And then we also invited all the retail outlets that supply fertilizer into that area. And then also the mayor of Fairbury, which is the main town in the watershed, he came on board. So we sort of had quite a wide range of interest in the steering committee.
Another program that is off to a strong start is Sand County Foundation's Land Ethic Mentoring Program. The mentoring program revolves around farmers helping farmers.
So our land ethic mentorship kicked off this past November, and we're working on that project through a NRCS Conservation Collaborative Grant. It's a 2-year project, and the goal of the project is to use conservation champions as mentors to the historically underserved farmers and ranchers. We use these Leopold Conservation Award recipients as the mentors to the historically underserved farmers and ranchers to communicate conservation practices that have worked effectively for them, to reduce the number of hurdles that beginning farmers have to overcome in order to be successful.
One of those farmer mentors is Paul Muller of Full Belly Farms in Northern California's Capay Valley. Muller and his partners farm 80 to 100 organic crops per year on 500 acres. They've been innovators in organic production and regenerative farm practices for decades, and they're committed to sharing their knowledge and passion for conservation.
So mentorship is critical. If we're going to grow another generation of people who are on the land, who are invested in the ethical relationship of a complex ecology and how they are part of that, how they are stewarding that. It's very different, and we're going to see a vast change in who owns land in this country in the next 20 years. As farmers retire, as hedge funds decide ag land is a good investment. We are committed to expanding the knowledge of what people's relationship with a place can be and why it's so important to invest yourself and sink your roots deep into a place. It's absolutely essential right now. There's a social connection between people and land and the communities that are engendered by that we're forgetting is a critical piece of the fabric of America and in any country. And so now we need to think about how we not see people being displaced by technologies, but how we look for tools and technologies and systems and ideas in order to bring food back from the local community back to the local community. And producers who know how to manage that land become reintegrated, and raise their kids on a place, love the place, have an ethical relationship with that place, and see it as a part of rebuilding rural communities. I think that's why we're involved in mentoring.
Connecting for Conservation isn't only about trying to convince farmers and landowners to adopt conservation systems. Kim Stackhouse-Lawson at Colorado State points out that she and her academic colleagues need to hear from the field, too.
Oftentimes I feel like these conduits, whether they're crop consultants or extension agents or, anybody who's actually in the field and listening to these producers and their challenges, that sometimes that voice doesn't get back to the university, and or sometimes that voice isn't listened to at the university, right? So sometimes it's about finding the right avenue to get that voice back into kind of the mothership, for lack of a better word. So I would ask every crop consultant to keep after it, to find that person at your university, or even if it's me, to say, hey, here's what I'm hearing and here's a solution, right, to get this back to you, because we need help solving this problem. I think that there needs to absolutely be more of that. And this sort of conversation is so important. If you're seeing something working locally and you think, my gosh, we should study this, freaking tell us to run a scientific project on it, or hey, this might be a really good idea, or I'm seeing this, and we'll go try to win grants to understand if there is scalability, because that's missing in a lot of these scientific questions. And so kind of helping us navigate would be my ask, and where I think you really help fit in, not just helping us as scientists navigate, but helping farmers and ranchers really navigate this wicked problem is really noble work.
Conservation technology continues to evolve. So does our understanding of how conservation impacts complex systems in soil and water. Meanwhile, there's another important evolution going on in conservation, a growing understanding about how to connect with farmers, landowners, non-farm neighbors, policymakers, and others to put conservation practices on the ground for everybody's benefit.
Connecting for conservation, now more than ever, is really about inclusivity and bringing people together, from all walks of life, from all production systems, and understanding how we can achieve, solutions that are for the good of everyone that's at the table.
We'd like to thank our generous sponsors for making it possible to bring this virtual tour to you today. CTIC is a member organization, and our members, sponsors, and partners are the key to our success in so many ways. To view this video again, see bonus online content, or find much more information about all kinds of conservation farming systems, visit our website at ctic.org.